Oh, there's a lot of excitement there. Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm excited to be here at Commit Your Code 2025. I actually went to Commit Your Code last year, and it is what persuaded me to start applying to speak at conferences. And it's the first conference I was accepted to speak at. Of course, now this is like my fifth talk of this year so far, but it feels really special getting to speak here for you all at CYC. So let's get into it. Let's start off with a quick intro. So who am I? My name is Leah Thompson. When I'm not found glued to my laptop with an IDE open, I can be found hiking, reading, or cuddling with my dogs, aka my senior developers. And they are old, so it is a fitting title. I work as a DevRel engineer at Laravel. So what does that mean? It means that I am on the DevRel, aka the developer relations team at Laravel. So I interact a lot with the Laravel community. I also go to conferences and give talks, but I also do a lot of engineering work. So I build out the marketing websites for our products at Laravel, as well as any websites the DevRel team needs. So I work on the blog, the community site that we have for Laravel that you can use to look for any meetups or conferences for Laravel, as well as I'm going to go ahead and apologize. I'm saying Laravel a lot, but as well as Laravel Learn, which we launched last week, which is our learning platform. It has a PHP fundamentals course and a Laravel bootcamp on it. But my journey into tech isn't the traditional one. I do not have a bachelor's of science in computer science. I actually majored in mathematics. So I worked as a high school geometry teacher for a year and a half before switching into tech. And whenever I got into tech, I didn't even start with PHP or a backend focused language. I started with JavaScript. So once I started getting into Laravel, which is a full stack framework for PHP, I started getting into PHP and Laravel last year. It made sense for me to leverage the React and JavaScript skills that I already had on the front end and pair that with the new skill I was trying to pick up of Laravel and PHP, which led me to start using the Wilt stack. So that stands for React.js, InertiaJS, Laravel, and Tailwind. And then the graphic here are the logos for those technologies. So this kind of leads into our topic for today, which is InertiaJS, or more specifically, using React with InertiaJS and how it can speed up things on the front end. So that kind of leads us to the big question of what even is InertiaJS. So I would love to see a show of hands. Please raise your hand if you've never heard of InertiaJS or you've never used it. Okay. It was like slow at first. I just saw 3 and I was like, there's no way you've already used Inertia. Okay, so this is the perfect talk. So we're going to go over what inertia is. But first, we're going to take a tiny step back and talk about the pain points you might have encountered if, like the traditional way, if you want to use JavaScript on the front end, but you want to use a different technology such as Java on the back end, so Java and Spring Boot, or Ruby on Rails, or Laravel and PHP, of course. So traditionally, you would end up with 2 separate projects, 2 separate repositories, one for the front end and one for the back end, which leads to these kind of pain points. So on the front end, you would have to write your fetch or Axios request to get the data from your API and then show it on the front end. You would also have your user fetch or state management, JSON parsing, client-side routing. You would have to deal with the CSRF token setup and then attaching that to your request. On the back end, you would end up with validation duplicated in the front and back end. So if you were doing error validation or form validation, you're going to do it in 2 different places. And you'd also have duplicate routes. So it's just a bunch of boilerplate code. You're copying a lot of the code. It's also, you're managing 2 separate applications. And that's where InertiaJS comes in. So InertiaJS gets rid of that problem. And it does that because it's a library that bridges your front and back end together. It does that by allowing you to write a monolith, and it removes a need for a separate API layer. So instead of having the two separate applications, everything lives in one application now. And you're not having to write all that boilerplate code. So to show up how you would implement this on the back end, this is a controller. So this is a Laravel controller. For InertiaJS, you do not have to use it with Laravel. The official package is maintained by Laravel now, but there are community adapters for other backend frameworks, such as Ruby on Rails, Spring and Java, Golang, Django. So you can use it with whatever backend framework you prefer. My examples are going to be using Laravel. So here we have a post controller. Inside of it, we have an index method, and we're just returning view of post.index. So this is a blade file, which is Laravel's templating language. So here we're just returning a front-end component. So this would be post.index.blade.php. That would be the file. But now if we want to change this to return a JavaScript or React component, this is all we would have to do using Inertia. This is all that would change. We're just having to bring Inertia in to our controller, and then instead of returning the blade view here, we're doing return Inertia render of post/index. So now this isn't a blade file. This would be our JSX or TSX file. And we just do Inertia render. And just like that, we're now using React. So this is how easy it is to bring Inertia in to the back end of things. But let's look at an example of bringing it in to the front end and how it makes things a little bit easier using React. And let's do that by looking at an example of something that we as developers use all the time, which are forms. Okay, so we're going to do a coding demo. For this, I'm going to show the same form. So the same form with just a name, email, and message input. But we're going to look at the code 3 different ways. So a traditional HTML form, a traditional React form, so just bringing React in, and then using the InertiaJS form helper to kind of really show where InertiaJS shines and how it helps with the boilerplate code. So if we look at the code for just the HTML version, here we just have a form element like we'd expect. We have to set up a CSRF token because it's required for Laravel post requests. And then inside of this, we just have our input fields for the 3 inputs we want. So here we have an input field type text for the name. This is a required field. We also have one for our email, which is also required. And then message, which is required as well. We only have one button here. So by default, this will submit the form whenever it's clicked. And that's it. So nice and clean, only 45 lines of code, but there's no dynamic state in here. We're not doing error validation, anything like that. This is just our simple HTML form. So now let's look at it, but with React. So already you can see this is way longer than the previous one, and it's getting kind of complex. We're bringing state in. So right away we have to import useState from React, and we're having to create all the state for our form data. So we have state here for the form data, which we are storing the dynamic data for our input fields in. So we have name, email, and message, which we are initializing to be empty strings. We're having to create state for errors, is submitting, and is submitted. Then we have a handle submit function we're having to create. Inside of this, if we are preventing the form from submitting on default, we're having to manually set the state for the different things, like set as submitting to true, initialize the errors to be empty, set as submitted to false. We're having to do our own client-side validation. So manual client-side validation, if we want to have specific error messages for each field. So we don't get that out of the box. We're also having to set our errors if there are some. Then we have our try and catch where we're doing the fetch request to our contact route to be able to submit the data when the user submits the form. If the response isn't okay, then we have to set the error data. If it is, then we set submitted to true. It's a bunch of state here. We also have a function for handle change. In this, we're just using our set form data to make sure that as the user is entering their data to the input field, it's dynamically updating. And then after 70 lines of code, we're finally at the form element. Here we're just using onSubmit is equal to handle submit that we set above. We have onChange equals to handle change. The value is equal to form data dot name, so the specific property field for on the form data, and we have that for all of our inputs. But here we do get some more, like we set up our own error validation, right? And we also have is submitted, so we know that if the form's submitted, then we can do some toast or whatever. But this is 115 lines of code, which maybe doesn't feel so bad, but if you're writing multiple forms a day or even a week, this adds up fast. Like you are doing a lot of boilerplate code that you don't need to do. So let's look at what the code would look like using InertiaJS's form helper. So already we got rid of the state. Now we're bringing in useForm from InertiaJS/React. And in here, instead of having to create my own state to hold the form data, instead I'm able to get data and set data from useForm, which useForm is the InertiaJS form helper. Let me zoom in more. Okay. So data is what my dynamic data for the fields are going to live on. So here I'm initializing properties of name, email, message, and form type, and initializing them. Set data is what I'll use to dynamically update them later on in the field. We're also able to get a post object from useForm. So here in our handle submit function, look how much shorter that is. We're not having to do a fetch or access request. Instead, we're able to just use the post object that we're getting from the InertiaJS form helper, pass that to the route, which is /contact, and then we can set an onSuccess function. And in this, we are going to reset all of the fields for the form after it's submitted, and reset as well comes directly from the InertiaJS form helper. So I'm not having to deal with any of that myself. We're also able to get processing errors and recently successful from the form helper. And errors here, before where we were having to do our own manual client-side validation for the errors, this is happening on the server side. So this is happening on your Laravel controller or whatever backend framework you're using. You don't have to deal with any of that on the front end. InertiaJS exposes it to your front end component. So if we scroll down now, in our form element, we have onSubmit equals our handle submit. OnChange, we're using set data that we got from the InertiaJS form helper. And then we're just using the errors that came from the server-side validation. And recently successful is what we're able to use now instead of having to create our own is submitted property to know if the button was submitted to show the code. Now we're at 40-something lines of code. This looks way cleaner than what we had before, right? Well, what if I told you it could be even shorter? And I promise it's not the like, what if we optimize more when you shouldn't? This is a good one. So as of 3 to 4 weeks ago, InertiaJS now has a form component. And the form component allows us to use syntax that is closer to I lost where my form was. But that is closer to the HTML form. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to remove useForm. And I'm going to change it to form. I can get rid of up here where we were getting data, set data, all of that from useForm, as well as our handle submit. We don't need that anymore. Here, we will get rid of this. And instead, same syntax as the regular HTML form. So we have action is the route we want to submit our form to. So /contact, the method is post. Let me go ahead and bring in some of this extra stuff. So I'm destructuring the object, bringing in the extra things I want from the form. I'm not using everything successful right now. I'm going to remove this one. Okay. And then for all of the input fields, we just need to remove this part. So we just need to remove our on-chain and value for each of these fields. And if we go to it, our form still works as expected. Yeah, did not break the live coding. We did it. And instead of 40 something lines of code, we are now at 22 lines of code. And that's it. Which if you look back at this one, which would you prefer? But this is kind of where InertiaJS shines and how it gets rid of a lot of boilerplate code. But let's think of some considerations or reasons people might be kind of concerned about using InertiaJS, especially in production. So I think a lot of people, when you talk about using a JavaScript framework on the front end, they think about SEO because they generally use client-side rendering. But InertiaJS offers an Inertia SSR, which is Inertia server-side rendering, right out of the box. And with Inertia SSR, it will pre-render the HTML. So when the user requests the page, it will deliver them the full HTML, which optimizes it for search engines. Now you might be thinking like, okay, that's great, but how hard is it to set that up in production? And honestly, it's never been easier. If you are using this with a Laravel backend, Laravel Cloud and Laravel Forge, which are two ways to deploy your Laravel applications, make it as easy as just hitting a toggle to enable Inertia server-side rendering on your server. And then to set it up locally, all you have to do are run these two terminal commands, and you have Inertia server-side rendering set up locally. And this is if you're using the Laravel 12 starter kits. So there's a starter kit for Vue and for React. If you use either of those, you just run these two commands and you have Inertia server-side rendering set up locally. So that's SEO. But let's talk about scalability. A lot of people wonder, does InertiaJS scale? Like, what production apps are using it? Do they get like 1 to 2,000 concurrent users? What does that look like? And the answer is yes. So, of course, we use InertiaJS internally at Laravel. We're going to practice what we preach. If we want you to use InertiaJS, we're going to use it. So for Laravel Cloud, which is the top box here, we use InertiaJS with React. We use it for Cloud and for Nightwatch, which is the bottom product. For Laravel Cloud, in the past 30 days, there have been 13 million requests. And for Laravel Nightwatch, which is the bottom box, there have been 3 million requests in the past 30 days. We're using React and Inertia for these applications. They've been able to handle that many requests, not have any bottlenecking, and I think that is a pretty good example of being able to use InertiaJS and the scalability of it. Of course, there were also features released in Inertia version 2 earlier this year that makes that possible as well, if you want to dive more into that in the InertiaJS docs. And then the last consideration is, okay, that's great. We've reduced a lot of boilerplate code, but what about types? Like, I don't want to have to use PHP on the back end, TypeScript on the front end, and have to manage types in two places, especially if I have to create some of my own manual types to really work with InertiaJS. And that is where Laravel Wayfinder comes in. So this would be specifically for Laravel. It is something that is being worked on currently because we're trying to find a way to really optimize the experience of using PHP on the back end and React or Vue on the front end, because you can use Vue with InertiaJS as well. We want to make it so that you can write your types in PHP. That's your source of truth. And then on the TypeScript side, you just use those types. You already have them. They're pre-generated. You're not having to worry about managing the types in two different places. You update it in the PHP file, you're done. And Laravel Wayfinder is the new package we're creating to do that, which it will be going into public beta this fall. So very soon, and it will be at version 1.0. So that's a quick glimpse of kind of into what Wayfinder is going to do. And I love it because it shows where this whole ecosystem is heading. So today I focus more on React and Inertia, but the bigger story is that Laravel keeps getting its tools that make front end and back end feel like one seamless experience. And I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll move. Okay.